So we're going to look at Milton's prose treatise Areopagitica today. We're looking at two of his treatises, pamphlets. These two are probably the best known, most famous. This particular one makes an allusion to a famous orator of the ancient world, rhetorician at any rate, by the name of Isocrates. I wonder if I can get to the board. Maybe. I'll try not to pull this down in a crashing heap. And his work was called the Logos Areopagitikos. The Areopagos is Mars Hill. Ares is Mars in Greek. Mars, the Roman god, Ares in Greek. And the Pagos, the hill, Mars Hill. This is the place on which the court, the High Supreme Court of Athens, met. Interesting bit of information. The Apostle Paul meets the philosophers famously on his Mars Hill address in Acts 17. And we know it because of that. But it's more famous and it has a longer legacy. I mean, when Paul, or rather the writer of Acts, mentions that Paul is addressing the Athenians at Mars Hill, his audience would understand this is a significant place and associated with all manner of things. But among other things, it's sort of a venue of public justice, as well as meeting the philosophers, discussing the nature of justice and the nature of the gods, etc. But Milton writes this pamphlet as the sort of political free speech that had been integral to Greek citizenship and liberty. And so he draws right at the beginning on an epigram. An epigram, so the little snippet right at the beginning here from Euripides: this is true liberty, when freeborn men, having to advise the public, may speak free, which he who can and will deserves high praise. Who neither can nor will may hold his peace. What can be juster in a state than this? So this is from Euripides, the famous tragedian, his play called The Suppliants. And this is taken from a speech between Theseus, who's one of the famous Athenian politicians, and the Theban herald. And the herald asks who the tyrant of the city is. It's in response to the question, who is the tyrant of the city? And Theseus retorts that there is no tyrant in this city because Athens is a free republic. And the herald is unimpressed at the response. And he complains, well, the common people can't even speak properly here. And he says they can't even speak, much less guide the city, because in Athens, citizenship is restricted to a property-owning class of men. And Theseus responds, there's nothing more hostile to a city than a tyrant. And notes therefore, but there is no tyranny here because men are allowed to speak freely. So in response to your objection that not all people are speaking, yes, but not all are able to speak, but those who can speak should be able to speak, and that's where liberty derives. From those who have the capacity and the willingness to do so, which he who can and will deserves high praise. So it's free speech for those who can and will. That context. Now, the copy of Euripides that Milton used to gloss this passage and begin his speech is written in terms of what we will call a parrhesia. It's a particularly bold form of speech, and it offers criticism. Let me write it down. What do I do with my thing? You won't know how to spell this because it's in Greek, and I think that's with it. It's 2 R's. Is that right? Have I got this wrong? No, that's correct. Parrhesia. It offers a criticism of his audience and at real risk to the speaker himself. So it's a very bold form of address. And this is often undertaken then by philosophers who are rebuking a tyrant. The tyrant, of course, has extraordinary capacity to inflict harm on the speaker who is defying his will. You would say that many of the speeches of the prophets in the Old Testament are of this form, parrhesia. So it's a direct confrontation when Moses speaks to Pharaoh and such forth. This is a form that is inviting the possibility of extraordinary censorship, if not death. And it's used in democratic Athens often by a distinguished citizen. So again, it's not just anybody. It's a citizen who's been known for his virtuous life, understood by the polis to have a certain weight and gravity to his address. And they will address the ecclesia or the public assembly. Now, the word ecclesia in Christian theology refers to the church, but more broadly and more correctly in terms of its etymology, it's just a gathered. It's those who are called together. So it's a public assembly. And this person is going to brave the disapproval of the majority. So Milton is not in his this address of free speech trying to win the approval of the majority. He's trying to win the approval of the just and the virtuous to his side. He's not appealing to the lowest common denominator. It's not demagoguery. He's trying to appeal as a virtuous man to the virtuous to do a certain course of action, to take a certain course of action. And Euripides, in that same play, The Phoenician Woman, says that the loss of this sort of ability to speak boldly and freely is the worst and greatest sorrow that a city can have. It's a sort of exile from true citizenship. And Jocasta, who speaks in this, you remember her from Oedipus Rex. Jocasta, her name. A slave's lot is this, says Jocasta, not saying what you think. That's a slave's lot, not being able to say what you think. If you are this sort of virtuous citizen. I remember those who can and will should speak and may speak freely. And the inability to speak freely by virtuous men in public is the worst thing that you can suffer individually, but also for a city itself, because the consequences of good individuals not speaking their minds freely in public out of fear of their lives is not only that they themselves will be tormented by that, but that the city or the republic that they would address is going to go in ruin. And so it's presented here in the speech as a sort of a parrhesia, and Milton himself is then as a parrhesiastes, and motivated by the love of liberty. So that's just the context there. And he follows in his speech here classical rhetorical strategies. By the way, this is a speech that was not delivered. It was written, it was a pamphlet. So context here probably matters in terms of historical context. Because what do we have in terms of historical context? Well, let me give you a little bit of background here. Because the challenge to the powers that be, the authorities, by a prophetic type of figure, of which Milton is here, that's never been well received. That's the cost of being a prophet. You bear a burden, and often prophets are abused, reviled, even by their own, and even killed. So that's there all along. But in the 15th century, we have the invention of the printing press. And this is not, so this is unique. This is not something that would have happened in the ancient world. Speeches were given. Occasionally, you would get public documents that were written as speeches, just like the epistles of Paul are written. They may have rhetorical strategies, but these are written documents and circulated in that way. But again, they have to be then copied in order to be distributed. And that happens by those who are capable of writing, and happens rather slowly, and it's a costly process. In the 15th century, we find that technology has changed culture significantly, because now you can print things extremely quickly and at relatively low cost. And that means ideas can spread quickly, but also that there are new challenges along with the opportunities that arise from the printing press. As I say, some say that the Reformation itself, this is one of the many factors which leads to the Protestant Reformation, the advent of the printing press, the rapid dissemination of ideas that moved so quickly that the counteroffensive, or the attempt to suppress ideas, was not able to succeed, because the ideas went out beyond the control of those who would have suppressed that. And I think it's a reasonable case, at any rate, to say that the printing press is an important part of the Protestant Reformation, not even just a theological matter, but the sheer advent of the printing press. And you could say that that's actually in God's own timing, that as well, that it happened then for that reason, just like Christ was born right in the middle of the reign of Caesar Augustus, right, who called himself the Great, and pronounced himself an emperor, which is wholly against the whole of the Roman political establishment. He's effectively a tyrant. And now he's saying that he is the King of Kings and Lords of Lords. That's actually Augustus's, I don't know what they do extraordinary. They decide to move vast quantities of something in a noisy fashion thank you. But this, the advent of the printing press, which made it possible to distribute written materials in great quantity with great speed, made censorship a new type of venture. Before, you could censor a person. You could arrest a person. How can you arrest a pamphlet? How can you stop it when it can be replicated so quickly and then you goes like this? That the problem has only intensified as technology has advanced. So now it's internet. It's through the electronic age. It's spread through a virtual mean. The same problem existed in the Soviet Union, and there's a whole movement. I'm not going to get distracted with this here, but something called samizdat. It's a self-publishing thing. Today, people self-publish. You can do this yourself. You don't need a publication house. You're a self-publisher. Who's the publisher that's endorsing this? I'm the publisher. I'm publishing it myself. I can put it out. People can download it and print it for themselves. There's a cost to doing it, but whatever. So technology has allowed for ideas to disseminate very rapidly, and now we're not even bound by geography, because the internet being everywhere, you can simply pull it off and print it out yourself. So the problem exists there, and continues to exist, of the challenges posed by technology to the truth, but also to the powers that be, and they're threatened by this, because it's a means of empowering those who are not in a position of political power. In the day of the 15th century, the Roman Catholic Church particularly was objected to what was happening from the pamphleteers, and published as a consequence a list of banned books, which was called the Index. So there was a whole Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1559. So there's a whole list of books that are basically prohibited to own, or to read for that matter, and they're to be seized and burnt. And it was updated over the centuries. Now, as I say, books were added to this list if they didn't comply with certain canon laws. So it's part of the Counter-Reformation, the Index of Banned Books. And this was done from the Catholic Church's vantage point to prohibit falsehood from being propagated. So that's the intention there, from the perspective of the reformers, it's to prevent the truth from being disseminated, right? But again, both see the power there of that. They're trying to regulate and prohibit the author's ideas. And there were two means of censorship. Either the books were regarded in relation to matters of faith and morals prior to their publication, or after the fact. So either before the fact or after the fact. And European governments recognized this threat and later adopted quite serious censorship laws, which persist to the current day, although they've liberalized much in recent years, to include things that, quite frankly, ought to be banned, like pornography and so forth, in my view. But these censorship laws increased political tensions between European governments, depending on how they favored the opinions in these pamphlets, depending on whether the governments were, let's say, favorable to the Reformation. So the Dutch and the English and the Swiss were favorable, and other countries more dominated by Roman Catholic theology were more hostile, and therefore discrepancies. So these, what were initially just religious tensions, became political tensions, hostilities rising just simply on this matter. And come the Anglican Reformation, when membership of the Church of England was obligatory to be in a position of authority. So at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, you had to be an Anglican to attend. To not only to teach there, but even to go to the universities, you were required to be an Anglican. No Catholics and no other non-Anglican Reform to be there. You couldn't be a Lutheran, couldn't be a Baptist, couldn't be Presbyterian, none of that. You had to be Anglican. And all the others who are non-Catholic were just simply called dissenters. They were dissenting. It's not that they were theologically opposed, but they opposed the formal, all of the rubric of being an Anglican. So they were excluded from that. So that's the context for Milton's work here. We're into the Anglican era. Remember Milton, when he went to Cambridge, he was an Anglican. He considered going into the Anglican clergy even. Not there now when he writes this, obviously, but at one time did. And it was strictly enforced, that is the censorship, during what a period called the 11 Years' Tyranny under Charles I. So, in other words, you have to be an Anglican, and that was being enforced through English public life under Charles I. Now, the great irony here is that he marries a Catholic. Right? Everybody in English public life must be an Anglican, not just Protestant, but an Anglican, but he marries a Catholic wife. So there's a great deal of resentment and sense of hypocrisy that arises because of that, obviously, which everyone will recognize. And during that 11 years tyranny, Charles refuses to convene Parliament. So he said, because he has to call a session of Parliament to sit. So for those 11 years, Parliament does not seat. He reigns as a tyrant. It's one man's rule, not going to consult with the other aristocrats and elected representatives in governing the country. So he abolishes that for 11 years. And uses instead something that he constructs called the Star Chamber. I'm just giving you, this is a little bit of English history, political context. There's something called the Star Chamber, which is a court called by Charles and really answering to him. It's notorious for politically favored judicial verdicts. So a Star Chamber is a sort of court which makes a mockery of justice. So to this day, you can talk about, the star chambers of our day. Sometimes people do this in newspapers. For a trial that's effectively rigged. You know what the outcome of the verdict is going to be. It's going to be in favor of the crown, every time. And that's what he has during there. So no Parliament. So involvement of the allegedly virtuous and noble men of the day, they're being excluded from government, and the means of judicial process is the Star Chamber. So you can see this is the context for the English Civil War, right? It didn't just come, they didn't like the king, didn't like the fact that he had a Catholic wife. There's a lot more to it than that. It's not just that, it's other things than that. And the mission of the Star Chamber is just simply to advise the king and serve as his judicial body. And so they try to control those processes even. So the courts of the Star Chambers are held in secret. It's not a public trial, it's a secret trial, and there is no appeals process. So you can imagine the sort of justice that's rendered in that context. And you can see, I think, a little bit more clearly why those that opposed the king were pushed and goaded towards the action which is unprecedented at that point in European history, which is not only to fight against the king and capture him, and then, by the way, they release him more than once. He says, okay, I'm going to reform, I'm going to go back to my ways, I'll go back and I won't do what I'm doing there, and then he goes back and does the same things he did before. So then another war was, and eventually they said, this guy's a liar, he is unreformable, his word means nothing, he's a tyrant, off with his head. Because we can't work with him. Just a little bit of context. And the sessions then that are held in secret are used to suppress sedition or political dissent. So if you're at an opposition party, today we have in Parliament an opposition. We have the government of the day and then we have opposition parties. The courts in his day were used to suppress any opposition of any sort, or anyone who expressed anti-royalist sentiments, whatever they were they religiously motivated, politically motivated, whatever, these were used to do this. So they already used a form of censorship. And when it came into force, Parliament abolished the Star Chambers. They said that public justice will be restored. We will have public trials. You have a right to an appeal. We will follow the law as it's laid down in Scripture. There are certain you have a right to a trial of your peers, open, public trial, just like in a sense on Mars Hill, and appeal to that. Even the pagans had a sense of a need for public justice, not secret justice. Parliament comes and abolishes the Star Chamber. But it still passed a bill related to censorship, and that's the context in which Milton writes. So when Milton writes this, in 1643, Parliament had just passed an ordinance for the regulating of printing to combat libel and piracy and royalist sentiments and etc., to suppress even more radical ideas. So Parliament itself passes a censorship bill. And all printed materials had to be licensed. In other words, they had to be approved. You couldn't do the same as that. You couldn't self-publish. You couldn't go to a private publishing house and publish stuff without approval from Parliament. So now it wasn't the Crown that was requiring approval, it was Parliament requiring the approval. In response to that, and this is in the middle of the Civil War, Milton publishes this thing. And again, even though he's on the parliamentarians' side, against his own side, against Parliament. Parliament does what the king had just done, what the Catholic Church is doing with the Index of Banned Books is doing exactly the same thing, and Milton writes against that. Okay, just context matters here. So these are men with whom he is already in strong agreement with, the parliamentarians. Yes, and you are doing it for political reasons, because of course you're being libeled and slandered and there's all sorts of stuff going on, and so you want to license that. Is that okay? Milton argues, right in the midst of these political and religious and even his marital tensions, remember I said he had problems with his wife, that the prior censorship, remember I said there are two forms, the censorship before it's even published and the censorship that comes after it's published. Milton objects to that before it's even published. In other words, you need approval before it even sees the light of day. That's what he objects to. Because then the truth never gets out there at all. That's what he ends up objecting to. After it's been published, if it's demonstrated to be slanderous, false, injurious to reputation, whatever, at that point, then you can come in and make the case for it to be pulled off, burnt, whatever. So not just any old opinions, not slanderous opinions, not malicious, whatever. Those should not be allowed to circulate. So Milton is not in favor of unbridled free speech as if he were a libertarian. You can't promote immorality and call it free speech. You can't promote pornography. That defense is used in the United States and has been for several decades now. They call it, well, I'm just expressing myself. Yes, I can see your bare body, and that's not expressing yourself. That's a distortion of what we call a defense of free speech. Something else is going on there, and with a different motivation. Any comments or questions there? So this becomes very influential, though. Milton's defense, this Areopagitica, is the first defense of free speech in the context of the technological age. It's not the first defense of free speech, because those had already been provided, as I say, as testified to even in that speech by Euripides. And it's part of the Athenian tradition to defend free speech. But in the context of an age of technology, when censorship was used in a different way, it is the first and it is the greatest. So the context of the American Civil War and freedom of speech, in tracing a history of free speech, they'll cite Mr. Milton regularly. Comments or questions there? But very influential on the Anglosphere, this speech. So both in England and also in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Canada, but Canada just inherits the British understanding of this. So high value on freedom of speech, but it's not an absolute, right? It should not, there are certain things that should, and it's censoring before the fact. The government should not be censoring ideas before require their approval before they come out. The government of Canada, as we speak, is proposing legislation that everything have to pass by a regulatory body before it even gets out right now. So Milton would have strong objections to that. It's not censorship after the fact, it's even before that. You have to get our approval in order to come into the public square. Same sorts of issues. Any comments or questions? I don't see any. So let me carry on then. So let me just read some of I'll read some of the passages here, and because I want to give you a sense of the grandeur of the rhetorical flourishes that he uses. As I say, it's very bold. Having said that, he is not attacked. When I say that he's bold and he's speaking against his own party, that is the Parliament, he's not attacking them with bromides. It's not a full frontal attack. He's using honey rather than vinegar, right? He's trying to attract them. He's appealing to them as virtuous men supporting the right causes, but you've made a grievous error here. With the intent of doing good, you've probably unwittingly done great harm. Don't adopt the same policies of your opponents here, because there is good reason to adopt a different policy. So it's trying to encourage them to do so. There is the possibility, having said that, because tensions are heightened, that he could be perceived to be an enemy of the cause. So it's not that there's no risk here. So it's Areopagitica, a speech for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. Note the subtitle. It's of unlicensed printing. You don't need to be licensed in order to print. Here's what he says. They, who to states and governors of the Commonwealth direct their speech, High Court of Parliament, or wanting such access in a private condition, write that which they foresee may advance the public good. I suppose them, as at the beginning of no mean endeavour, not a little altered and moved inwardly in their minds, some with doubt of what will be the success, others with fear of what will be the censure, some with hope, others with confidence of what they have to speak. And me perhaps each of these dispositions, as the subject was whereon I entered, may have at other times variously affected, and likely might in these foremost expressions now also disclose which of them swayed most. But that the very attempt of this address thus made, and the thought of whom it hath recourse to, hath got the power within me to a passion far more welcome than incidental to a preface. So you already know, this is a long introduction. And I mentioned to you offline last time, we need to understand that Milton's form of writing here, which is called prose is also different in this era. This is not he's not writing sentences. In schools today, we're taught to write in sentences, a complete sentence at that. Right? Don't follow the way we speak, which is abrupt and interrupted and follows your thoughts. Do it in a different form. Now, the sentence form is considered to be a little bit more literary, and it is, because it's a completed thought, it's grammatically correct, etc. There's a subject, a verb, an object, etc. It might have some length to it. You could have subclauses and so forth. They make it complicated, but still it will end with a full stop or what we call a period. In England, they call it a full stop. Full stop. And that will be the form of persuasion. A sentence, and then another, and the gathering of the sentences, if you want to then divide it and separate it in a logical block of argument, you call it a paragraph, and then a space between them. That's not how Milton is writing here, not the form. So let me say a little bit about that. He is writing in the form of classical rhetoric. And the form of classical rhetoric, of prose, is not the sentence, but what they call the period. And a period is a rhetorically constructed structure whose purpose then, as the word rhetoric suggests, is persuasion. And persuasion depends not only the truth of the sentiments, but the beauty and the force of the argument. And so you will see that it does various things just simply in the construction of the syntax and the way it's put on the page through all these the punctuation mark we call the semicolon. Don't confuse the rhetorical structure of the period with the punctuation mark, the period. The period here is the form of rhetorical construction. He follows the model of Greek and Roman rhetoric in constructing his prose that way. So you'll notice the back and forth, and I tried to read it this way as well. And it would be on the one hand, on the other. It's bouncing back and forth, and it tends to be this dualistic way of things. It could be this, it could be that, and it keeps moving on. But there's a lot of, rather than going like a sentence in a straight line, and then another straight line and another straight line, which is more like speech and more direct, there's a little bit more nuance, and there's a little bit of a dance going on. So you say this, and then you consider another part of the argument, and then you consider this part, and then you move on, and so forth. And there's a little bit of that circuitous type of logic. And within the this way and that way, there's sometimes an opposition of things, or there's a complementarity to the different perspectives, which is then carried on. And you'll note that Paul's epistles and many of the epistles written in the New Testament will adopt this same rhetorical strategy. And when we translate them into modern English, we translate also the rhetorical, not just the words, but even the whole logic of how it's constructed to fit the form of the sentence, when really it's held together as an idea that goes beyond a sentence. And you'll note that in some of Paul's epistles. The block of ideas goes on for a great long time. So for instance, in John's Gospel, John 1 to 14, that's a period. That whole thing. It's a flow, and you don't want to interrupt it with a full stop, because it's to be seen as one persuasive introduction. And so it should be read that way. It's often called the prologue. But really it's a period. And Paul regularly writes like that, and we don't. And I think we lose something with that, because there's a flow, and you don't want to interrupt it. Don't stop reading. Read it through, and then finish at the period. And you will recognize that because an idea has been completed. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? And that's how it begins. And how does it conclude? How does John 1:14 conclude? Something about the Lord pitched his tent among us, or became incarnate, right? So that's how that whole semantic structure concludes. In the beginning, and there, bang. The Creator is the Redeemer. That act of creation is connected to the act of redemption. semantically, rhetorically, whatever. It's written with rhetoric in mind, and rhetoric with persuasion. That's why you write. You don't write just to convey information. That's what you do for your shopping list. I can write that down as well. It is also called writing. It's a different form of writing. That's just to hold on to information. Well, you can do that on the internet as well. There's all sorts of information. This is a form of writing whose purpose is persuasion, right? And he's adopting it according to the famous rhetorician Isocrates, his Mars Hill address, Milton likewise. The context, I'm talking about what is legal, and I'm talking before the supreme court of the land, as it were. Okay, so that's how it begins. And I'll read on a little bit. Which though I stay not to confess, ere any ask, I shall be blameless, if it be no other than the joy and gratulation which it brings to all who wish and promote their country's liberty. Whereof this whole discourse proposed will be a certain testimony, if not a trophy. For this is not the liberty which we can hope, that no grievance ever should arise in the Commonwealth, that let no man in this world expect. But when complaints are freely heard, deeply considered, and speedily reformed, then is the utmost bound of civil liberty attained that wise men look for. To which, if I now manifest by the very sound of this which I shall utter, that we are already in good part arrived, and yet from such a steep disadvantage of tyranny and superstition grounded into our principles as was beyond the manhood of a Roman recovery, it will be attributed first, as is most due, to the strong assistance of God, our deliverer. Next, to your faithful guidance and undaunted wisdom, lords and commons of England. Neither is it, in God's esteem, the diminution of his glory when honorable things are spoken of good men and worthy magistrates, which if I now first should begin to do after so fair a progress of your laudable deeds, and such a long obligement upon the whole realm to your indefatigable virtues, I might be justly reckoned among the tardiest and the unwillingest of them that praise ye. So you can see, he's not flattering them. He's acknowledging that he's speaking to good men. Right? Again, it's still bold. It's against their own bill. So there's a boldness to it, and the times are tempestuous. But it's not that he maligns their character and so forth. He says this is unwise. But that's not because I'm attacking you. So there's no ad hominems in this. It's bold without that, right? Nevertheless, there being three principal things without which all praising is but courtship and flattery. Three things. First, when that only is praise which is solidly worth praise. Next, when greatest likelihoods are brought that such things are truly and really in those persons to whom they are ascribed. The other, when he who praises, by showing that such his actual persuasion is of whom he writes, can demonstrate that he flatters not. The former two of these I have heretofore endeavored, rescuing the employment from him who went about to impair your merits with a trivial and malignant encomium. So somebody had attacked Parliament for this already. His name is Joseph Hall. And he attacked the merits in Parliament and their character and their intention and all that. Not the latter as belonging chiefly to mine own acquittal. That whom I so extolled I did not flatter, hath been reserved opportunely to this occasion. For he who freely magnifies what hath been nobly done, and fears not to declare as freely what might be done better, gives ye the best covenant of his fidelity, and that his loyalest affection and his hope waits on your proceedings. His highest praising is not flattery, and his plainest advice is a kind of praising. For though I should affirm and hold by argument that it would fare better with truth, with learning, and the Commonwealth, if one of your published orders, which I should name, were called in, yet at the same time it could not but much redound to the luster of your mild and equal government. whereas private persons are hereby animated to think ye better pleased with public advice than other statists have been delighted heretofore with public flattery. How high am I going to praise you? That being rebuked in public, you will receive it in the same way that those who were of lesser character receive public flattery, because you are humble men and receive censor or criticism in the spirit in which it's intended. That's how highly I regard you. And men will then see the difference there is between the magnanimity or the great spiritedness of a triennial parliament. Parliament meets 3 times a year. And that jealous haughtiness of prelates and cabin councillors that usurped of late, whenas they shall observe ye in the midst of your victories and successes more gently brooking written exceptions against devoted order than other courts, which had produced nothing worth memory but the weak ostentation of wealth, would have endured the least signified dislike at any sudden proclamation. So he's recognizing he's speaking against a bill of censorship, and there had been one before. You're going to show that you're different by not crushing me as Charles I would have. And his courts would have prosecuted me privately, etc. You're not going to do that because I recognize that your character is different. If I should thus far presume upon the meek demeanor of your civil and gentle greatness, lords and commons, as what your published order hath directly said that to gainsay, I might defend myself with ease, if any should accuse me of being new or insolence, new being presumptuous, or insolent. Did they know but how much better I find ye esteem it to imitate the old and elegant humanity of Greece than the barbaric pride of a Hunnish and Norwegian stateliness? Interesting. Disparages the Germans and the Norwegians, those countries that are clearly not having the inheritance of liberty that the Greeks are. So he explicitly appeals to the Greeks. And we'll find next time when we look at his treatise of education, he also recommends the study of the classics for that same reason. There's a tradition of liberty there. And we appeal to that. Even though we're actually Anglo-Saxons, he doesn't use the word, but there's a Germanic inheritance here that we have, but this one is even better. It's not our native born. It's actually belonging to a different climate and a different context, but we would rather have that here. We want Athens in England. And yet we can do better than Athens, because now we have the truth of the gospel. Anyway, and out of those ages, to whose polite wisdom and letters we owe that we are not yet Goths and Jutlanders, I could name him who from his private house wrote that discourse to the Parliament of Athens, that persuades them to change the form of democracy which was then established. Who's the reference to? Well, it's to Isocrates. I'll skip over this a little bit, but towards the end of that paragraph, how far you excel them, that is the Huns and the Prussians, or not the Prussians, the Huns and the Norwegians, can no greater testimony appear than when your prudent spirit acknowledges and obeys the voice of reason, from what quarter soever it be heard speaking, and renders ye as willing to repeal any act of your own setting forth as any set forth by your predecessors. You were willing to set aside the legislation of Charles I first because it was irrational and injurious to the body public. I'm appealing to the same reason that will lead you to overturn your own act of censorship. So he's appealing to reason and them as reasonable men. You've demonstrated that you were reasonable in the past. Demonstrate it now. Don't only overturn what he did, overturn what you yourself did. Making an appeal to reason. If ye be thus resolved, as it were injury to think ye were not, that is rational, I know not what should withhold me from presenting ye with a fit instance wherein to show both that love of truth which ye eminently profess, and that uprightness of your judgment which is not wont to be partial to yourselves. Remember the Star Chamber. your judgment, which is not wont to be partial to yourselves, by judging over again that order which ye have ordained, quote, and now he's quoting their own legislation, to regulate printing, that no book, pamphlet, or paper shall be henceforth printed, unless the same be first approved and licensed by such, or at least one of such, as shall be thereto appointed. So now he's directly citing their own legislation. This is what you should repeal. And he gives reasons for that. For that part which preserves justly every man's copy to himself, or provides for the poor, I touch not. Only wish they would not be made pretenses to abuse and persecute honest and painful men. Painful here he means painstaking, those who are careful, who offend not in either of these particulars, but that other cause of licensing books, which we thought had died with his brother, quadragesimal and matrimonial, when the prelates expired, I shall now attend with such a homily as shall lay before ye. And now he gives 3 reasons. First, the inventors of it to be those whom ye will be loath to own. Next, what is to be thought in general of reading, whatever sort the books be, and that this order avails nothing to the suppressing of scandalous, seditious, and libelous books, which they mainly intended to be suppressed. Last, that it will be primely to the discouragement of all learning, and the stop of truth, not only by disexercising and blunting our abilities in what we know already, but by hindering and cropping the discovery that might be yet further made, both in religious and civil wisdom. So these are the 3 arguments. It doesn't, you're going to act like the people that you despise because of their character, because of their pride, and at the same time their oversensitivity to criticism. Secondly, we can still censor libelous and scandalous and seditious books. There's another way of doing that. You wait till they're published, then you can do that. But requiring licensing before the fact is going to do something different. And what is that it going to do? Well, it would discourage all truth, all learning, ultimately, and new discoveries of learning. It will prevent that. So this is in the context, remember, this is on the cusp, a few years before what we call the scientific revolution. And probably has in mind also what happened to Galileo. He has an idea, and he'll appeal to the example of Galileo in this. He challenges the dominant scientific view of how cosmology works. And what did he get for this? He got house arrest. And his books under censorship and so forth. Now he gets to the famous parts of the passage. Interesting introduction, some famous excerpts here. I deny not, but that it is of the greatest concernment in the church and commonwealth to have a vigilant eye how books demean ourselves as well as men, and thereafter to confine, imprison, and do sharpest justice on them as malefactors. For books are not absolutely dead things, famous quote, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. Nay, they do preserve as in a vial the purest efficacy and extraction of that lively intellect that bred them. I know they are as lively and as vigorously productive as those fabulous dragon's teeth, Cadmus. They were sewed into the ground, they popped up as men. Appeals to a myth. And being sewn up and down may chance to spring up armed men. And yet, on the other hand, unless wariness be used, as good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Now note there, he is talking about a good book, not all books. A good book. If you do this, you kill reason itself. You're not only striking at the man, the imago Dei, you're striking at reason itself, and the word is the means of doing that. Now note, Jesus, the Word of God, is intensely and intimately connected to the written word, to Scripture and Scripturation. Jesus is referred to by John in John's Gospel as the Word of God. He's the living Word. When he speaks, God is speaking, but we don't have everything that Jesus ever said. We have the written word, and the written word leads us to the living word, because Jesus refers to himself in what he's referring and also what he has to say to us. And so there's a strong emphasis on the importance of defending the written word. Remember, this is in the context of the translation of the Bible into the English language, which was also opposed in the Reformation by the church. And the consequence of that is to bring the reasoning, the mind of God to the common people. They can read it. He doesn't cite that here. But note that he recognizes the potency and the power of the word if it's written by bad men. So I'm not denying that that's there. It is a potentially serious problem. But here is the good, which is far greater than the threat. And by trying to diminish the threat, you're simply going to diminish the good. And that will create another threat, which is far greater. Then he goes on. Many a man lives a burden to the earth, but a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. Now he quotes, no, he doesn't quote. "'Tis true, no age can restore a life, whereof perhaps there is no great loss. And revolutions of ages do not oft recover the loss of a rejected truth, for the want of which whole nations fare the worst." Now note that. People's lives pass away. The truths that they articulate, if those are lost, will destroy not just the individual life that was lost, but the whole nations that don't get the fruit of that productive life. We should be wary, therefore, what persecution we raise against the living labors of public men, how we spill that seasoned life of man, preserved and stored up in books. Since we see a kind of homicide may be thus committed, sometimes a martyrdom, and if it extend to the whole impression, a kind of massacre, whereof the execution ends not in the slaying of an elemental life, but strikes at the ethereal and fifth essence, the breath of reason itself, slays an immortality rather than a life. But lest I should be condemned of introducing license, while I opposed licensing, I refuse not the pains to be much historical, as will serve to show that hath been done by ancient and famous commonwealths against this disorder, till the very time that this project of licensing crept out of the Inquisition, was catched up by our prelates, and hath caught some of our presbyters, because in Scotland they're doing the same sorts of things. And he's very critical of this, is Milton. Because again, in Scotland, they say that the form of church government that God ordains is the rule of elders. And therefore, the church must have an eldership model of churchmanship and not just presbyteries, but sessions, or local sessions, but whole presbyteries. And that's the form of government that God has ordained. Whether they be right or wrong, they're saying this is the way and there can be no other. Milton disagrees. It should not be so. So that's what he means by that. And they would censor opposing forms. Now he's going to cite precedent here. In Athens, where books and wits were ever busier than in any other part of Greece, I find but only two sorts of writings which the magistrate cared to take notice of. Those either blasphemous and atheistical or libelous. So it's either blasphemous and atheist or it's libelous. Those are the sort that they censored. Thus the books of Protagoras were by the judges of Areopagus commanded to be burnt, and himself banished the territory, for a discourse began with his confessing not to know, quote, whether there were gods or whether not. That was enough. Burn his work, said Athens. And against defaming, it was decreed that none should be traduced by name, as was the manner of Vitas Commedia, whereby we may guess how they censured libeling, and this course was quick enough, as Cicero writes, to quell both the desperate wits of other atheists and the open way of defaming, as the event showed. Of other sects and opinions, though tending to a voluptuousness and the denying of divine providence, they took no heed. Therefore, we do not read that either Epicurus or that libertine school of Cyrene, the skeptics, and both of them teach that the end of life is to enjoy pleasure. That's the purpose of life. Or what the cynic impudence uttered was ever questioned by the laws. They left them alone. They didn't care about that. Neither is it recorded that the writings of those old comedians were suppressed, though the acting of them were forbid. So we're not going to suppress your writing, but we're going to forbid you to act them in public square because, of course, the matters being depicted there are vulgar, quite frankly. If you ever look at the old comedies. And that Plato commended the reading of Aristophanes, the loosest of them all, to his royal scholar Dionysius is commonly known, and may be excused if holy Chrysostom, as is reported, nightly studied so much the same author, and had the art to cleanse scurrilous vehemence into the style of a rousing sermon. Chrysostom, famous St. John's Chrysostom, 347 to 407 AD, noted for his eloquence. He read the most scandalous of the Greek comic writers, Aristophanes. And what would that encourage us to do then? Based on the example of Chrysostom, do we not want young men to follow the example of Chrysostom? Yes. Well, then why would we forbid the sort of books that Chrysostom himself read? Right? And he can see the direction, the trajectory of this in the name of, well, he's promoting immorality in the books. Not a good reason. That other leading city of Athens, Lacedaemon, considered that, that's Sparta, considered that Lycurgus, their lawgiver, was so addicted to elegant learning as to have been the first that brought out of Ionia the scattered works of Homer, and sent the poet Thales from Crete to prepare and mollify the Spartan surliness with his smooth songs and odes, the better to plant among them law and civility. It is to be wondered how museless and unbookish they were, minding naught but the feats of war. So even the Spartans, who despised learning and thought it was unmanly, were persuaded from their own brethren by people who were reading Homer, etc., when they needed to. It was a useful thing. It's entirely useful and needs to be upheld. There needed no licensing of books among them, for they disliked all but their own laconic apothegms, and took a slight occasion to chase Achillicus out of their city, perhaps for composing in a higher strain than their own soldierly ballads and roundels could reach to. And then he moves on to the Romans. I'm going to skip over the Romans. So he goes, but he's doing what he often does in his epic, we'll see as well. He gives us a sort of a history of the development of the genre in which he's talking about, and then he'll get to rhetoric. I'll skip over the Roman period. Let's come to the Christianization then. Page 10 if you're following this edition. By this time, the emperors were become Christians, whose discipline in this point I do not find to have been more severe than what was formerly in practice. So even though they're Christians, they were not more censorious. The books of those whom they took to be grand heretics were examined, refuted, and condemned in the general councils, and not till then were prohibited or burnt by authority of the emperor. Not till then. So first they were allowed to be published, then to be read, then to be scrutinized, and only after a judgment that absolutely this is so in a council, okay, now this has to go. As for the writings of heathen authors, unless they were plain invectives against Christianity, as those of Porphyrius and Proclus, they met with no interdict that can be cited till about the year 400 in a Carthaginian council, wherein bishops themselves were forbid to read the books of Gentiles, but heresies they might read. while others, long before them, on the contrary, scrupled more the books of heretics than of Gentiles. And that the primitive councils and bishops were wont only to declare what books were not commendable. So that's what they declared. They didn't have an index of banned books. They said, here are a list of books that we don't commend. But we don't commend these. Okay, but that doesn't mean you can't read them. We just don't commend them. Passing no further, but leaving it to each one's conscience to read or lay by, till after the year 800 is observed already by Padre Paolo, the great unmasker of the Trentine Council, after which time the popes of Rome, engrossing what they pleased of political rule in their own hands, extended their dominion over men's eyes, as they had before over their judgments, burning and prohibiting to be read what they fancied not, yet sparing in their censures, and the books not many which they dealt with, till Martin the Fifth, by his bull, Martin the Fifth, in his bull, the Pope between 1417 and 1431, so right during the time of Luther, not only prohibited, but was the first that excommunicated the reading of heretical books. For about that time, Wycliffe and Huss, Jan Hus, John Wycliffe College downtown, growing terrible, were they who first drove the papal court to a stricter policy of prohibiting, which course Leo X and his successors followed until the Council of Trent and the Spanish Inquisition, engendering together brought forth or perfected these catalogues and expurging indexes that rake through the entrails of many an old good author with a violation worse than could be afforded to his tomb. Nor did they stay in matters heretical, but any subject that was not to their palate, they either condemned in a prohibition or had it straight into the new purgatory of an index. Okay, so now he's moved from there to the current state of affairs. Athens and Rome were freer. The early church were freer. Now we get to the modern era, and he's specifically addressing it to the growth of the papacy, which he's probably likening implicitly here to Charles I, what he also did, right? It's a power move. It's not done for the sake of promoting the good. It's to prevent any form of, it's basically their taste being imposed on all others. I'll skip over this little section here and move on a couple of pages. He cites Friar Niccolo Rodolfi, etc. But now things have to be approved, and the word for that is imprimatur. Everything goes through the Pope's office, and the word imprimatur is put on it. So that word becomes famous, the Latin word print, imprimatur, right? Okay, we're allowed, now it can go forward. It has to be approved before, so forth. And thereafter, in the English language, we will use the word imprimatur without the imprimatur or the approval of the authorities. And thus, to summarize, ye have the inventors and the original of book licensing ripped up and drawn as lineally as any pedigree. We have it not, that can be heard of from any ancient state, or polity, or church, nor any statute left us by our ancestors, elder or later, nor from the modern custom of any reformed city or church abroad, but from the most anti-Christian council and the most tyrannous inquisition that ever inquired. Till then, books were ever as freely admitted into the world as any other birth. The issue of the brain was no more stifled than the issue of the womb. No envious Juno sat cross-legged over the nativity of any man's intellectual offspring. But if it proved a monster, who denies but that it was justly burnt or sunk into the sea? But that a book in worse condition than a peccant soul, a sinful soul, should be to stand before a jury ere it be brought to the world, and undergo yet in darkness the judgment of Radamanth and his colleagues, ere it can pass the ferry backward into light, was never heard before, till that mysterious iniquity, provoked and troubled at the first entrance of Reformation, sought out new limbos and new hells, wherein they might include our books also within the number of their damned. And this was the most rare counsel so officiously snatched up and so ill-favoredly imitated by our inquisitorial bishops and the attendant minorities of the chaplains. So the Anglicans under Charles I did exactly what the Roman Catholic Church did. They weren't the Pope, they were Anglican, yet they adopted the exact same strategies. And you opposed them. You demanded freedom from that. You did rightly so. That ye like not now these most certain authors of this licensing order, and that all sinister intention was far distant from your thoughts when ye were importune the passing of it. All men who know the integrity of your actions and how ye honor truth will clear ye readily. So I'm not saying you were like them. Your intention was certainly not their intention. But some will readily say that though the inventors were bad, the thing for all that may be good. It may so. Yet if that thing be no such deep invention, but obvious and easy for any man to light on, and yet best and wisest commonwealths through all ages and occasions have forborne to use it, that is censorship, and falsest seducers and oppressors of men were the first who took it up, and to no other purpose but to obstruct and hinder the first approach of Reformation, I am those who believe it will be a harder alchemy than Lullius ever knew to sublimate any good use of such an invention as censorship. It was only ever used in the context of suppressing the truth which the Reformation unleashed, that of the primitive church, which was being suppressed by the growing power of the Roman councils in the refusal to allow the masses to receive the truth. Yet this only is what I request to gain from this reason, that it may be held a dangerous and suspicious fruit, as certainly it deserves for the tree that bore it, until I can dissect one by one the properties it has. But I have first to finish, as was propounded, what it is to be thought in general of reading books, whatever sort they be, and whether it be more the benefit or the harm that thence proceeds. So now he's going to talk about the benefits of books in general. What is the benefit of books? So he moves on from that. Let's talk about the virtues of books. Not to insist upon the examples of Moses, Daniel, and Paul, who were skillful in all the learning of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Greeks, which could not probably be without reading their books of all sorts. In Paul especially, who thought it no defilement to insert into Holy Scripture the sentences of 3 Greek poets, and one of them a tragedian. The question was notwithstanding sometimes controverted among the primitive doctors. So the early church did have a little disagreement over this. But with great odds on that side which affirmed it both lawful and profitable, as was then evidently perceived under Julian the Apostate, and subtlest enemy to our faith, made it decree forbidding Christians the study of heathen learning. For, said he, they wound us with our own weapons, and with our own arts and sciences they overcome us. So there's only one amongst the early church fathers who advocated censorship, and he's called Julian the Apostate. Interesting. He was recognized. And what did he try to do? He tried to promote purity. What did he do? The opposite of his intention, right? So again, it really helps to have a knowledge of history. I can't overemphasize it. Cicero said that a person who does not know history is permanently a child. And indeed the Christians were put so to their shifts by this crafty means, and so much in danger to decline into all ignorance, that the 2 Apollinarii were fain, as a man may say, to coin all the 7 liberal sciences out of the Bible, reducing it into diverse forms of orations, poems, dialogues, even to the calculating of a new Christian grammar. So there were Christians, and what were they? They were Apollinarii. What are they? They are rhetoricians, and perhaps even heretics, that rewrote the Bible. And did what? They were reluctant to see the 7 liberal arts because they couldn't find it in the Bible. They only wanted to see orations in Scripture, dialogues, and a Christian grammar will be taken directly out of Scripture. They were biblicists. They didn't want to appeal to the 7 liberal arts, right? They're trying to be faithful. They're trying to be puritanical in a sense in terms of doctrinal purity, and yet they were going to deny what reason itself sees, that the 7 liberal arts are a gift that the ancient world discovered that Christians otherwise had held on to and used to promote learning. Isn't that interesting? This is why I think classical education is undergoing a revival in our day, because exactly that, retrieval of the 7 liberal arts. That he might, I'm jumping on a little bit, even though, and he's going to cite the apostle here. The worthy man, loath to give offense, fell into a new debate with himself what was to be thought, when suddenly a vision came from God. It is his own epistle that so avers it, confirmed him in this words: read any books whatsoever come to thy hands, for thou art sufficient both to judge aright and to examine such matter. Citing Scripture. To this revelation he assented the sooner, as he confesses, because it was answerable to that of the apostle to the Thessalonians. That wasn't the apostle writing there, by the way, but it is here. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Prove all things, test all things, hold fast to that which is good. And he might have added another remarkable saying of the same author: to the pure all things are pure. Not only meats and drinks, but all kinds of knowledge, whether of good or evil, the knowledge cannot defile, nor consequently the books, if the will and conscience be not defiled. For books are as meats, and viands are some of good, some of evil substance. And yet God in that unapocryphal vision said, without exception, rise, Peter, kill and eat, leaving the choice to every or in each man's discretion. Wholesome meats to a vitiated stomach differ little or nothing from unwholesome. So if you've got a bad stomach, it doesn't matter if the food's good. You're not going to be able to swallow it. And best books to a naughty mind are not applicable to occasions of evil. Even a good book can make a bad man do a bad thing. Bad meats will scarce breed good nourishment in the healthiest concoction. But herein the difference is, of bad books, that they to a discreet and judicious reader serve in many respects to discover, to confute, to forewarn, and to illustrate. So let's read bad arguments written by bad men, because these will be an example of the sorts of things that are said, and we will now know how to confute, contradict them, right? To demonstrate their falsehood, because we'll be acquainted with them. We wouldn't have thought that way because we're not. We're more reasonable than that. But still, here's the arguments. I'm going to skip over a little bit here. I conceive, therefore, that when God did enlarge the universal diet of man's body, that he says, eat of the things that I formerly forbidden you to do. So he's continuing the analogy of take, Peter, kill, and eat. When he enlarged the universal diet of man's body, saving ever the rules of temperance, he then also, as before, left arbitrary, that is up to the will, the dieting and repasting of our minds. It wasn't just our physical appetites for food, but also of our minds, as wherein every mature man might have to exercise his own leading capacity. How great a virtue is temperance! How much of moment through the whole life of man! Yet God commits the managing so great a trust without particular law or prescription, wholly to the demeanor of every grown man. Some men have greater capacity and greater virtue to be able to handle these books. Why should lesser men, he's going to come to this argument, why should lesser men rule men who have more virtue? Because that's what you end up getting. In secret, you get the bureaucrats, and you get the tyrants using means of censoring the very virtue that would be the salvation of their own republic. Solomon himself informs us that much reading is a weariness to the flesh, but neither he nor other inspired author tells us that such or such reading is unlawful. Yet certainly had God thought good to limit us herein, it had been much worse, more expedient to have told us that what was unlawful than what was wearisome, especially in this case. Would God not have told us if it were that important? As for the burning of those Ephesian books by St. Paul's converts, 'tis replied the books were magic. The Syriac so renders them. It was a private act, a voluntary act, and leaves us to a voluntary imitation. If we want to, fine, go ahead, but it's not a prescript. That men in remorse burnt those books which were their own. The magistrate, by his example, is not appointed to do it for him. So if you own books that you had before you converted and you find them disgusting and whatever, and you want to, as an act of faithfulness, burn the books, go ahead and do it. Don't tell others they have to do it. Good. Now here's the final bit here, because I'll run out of time, but this is a very important point, and I'm going to conclude with it. Good and evil, we know, in the field of this world, grow up together almost inseparably. Just think of the wheats and the tare. And the knowledge of good is so involved and interwoven with the knowledge of evil, and in so many cunning resemblances hardly to be discerned, that those confused seeds which were imposed upon psyche as an incessant labor to cull out and sort asunder were not more intermixed. It was from out the rind of one apple tasted that the knowledge of good and evil, thinking of the Garden of Eden here now, as two twins cleaving together leapt forth into the world. And perhaps this is that doom which Adam fell into, of knowing good and evil, that is to say, of knowing good by evil. As therefore the state of man now is, what wisdom can there be to choose, what continence to forbear without the knowledge of evil? We need evil. We need to be acquainted with evil. We know good by evil. It's a negative example. It's the illustration I sometimes use, I've heard used, and I think is a good one. Think of the brightness of a diamond. If you go into a jewelry shop, what's the backdrop for the diamond? They have the light on the diamond that makes it sparkle, but they have a black matte backdrop that absorbs the light. So you can see the brilliance of the diamond. That's how God uses evil in this world, as a means to amplify the good and the true. And he says, he that can apprehend and consider vice with all her baits and seeming pleasures, and yet abstain, and yet distinguish, and yet prefer that which is truly better, he is the true wayfaring Christian. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race, where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Assuredly we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. That virtue, therefore, which is but a youngling in the contemplation of evil, and knows not the utmost that vice promises to her followers, and rejects it, is but a blank virtue, not a pure. Her whiteness is but excremental whiteness, which was the reason why our sage and serious poet Spenser, whom I dare be known to think a better teacher than Scotus or Aquinas, describing true temperance under the person of Guion, brings him in with his palmer through the cave of mammon and the bower of earthly bliss, that we might see and know and yet abstain. See and know and yet abstain. And then finally this, since therefore the knowledge and survey of vice is in this world so necessary to the constituting of human virtue, and the scanning of error to the confirmation of truth, how can we more safely and with less danger scout into the regions of sin and falsity than by reading all manner of tractates and hearing all manner of reason? And this is the benefit which may be had of books promiscuously read. Promiscuous in the sense of read all over the place. I'll conclude with that. I mean, he goes on, and it's so great. But he commends, for the reasons that I suggested at the outset, the Parliament to overturn its own edict. It does not do what he asks, by the way, just so you know. As persuasive as I think the Areopagitica is, as magnificent as it is, the Parliament did not revoke its own edict on this, but this treatise remains a monument to everything that Milton held to be true. And we'll see it represented in his poetry. his belief in the power of truth in the midst of falsehood and light in the midst of darkness, that will be represented repeatedly. And it's like one man standing and saying his truth against an age that does not perceive the power of truth. It's almost Milton himself being portrayed in his own works. Anyway, I'll leave it off with that for now.